We're ready.
Well, hello?
Banger,
Hello, can you hear me down the end of the table? Jacob, can you hear me? Good, okay. If Jacob can hear me, we're in business. So thank you all for coming. This is a very distinguished group to listen to two distinguished speakers talk about an unbelievably complicated and important subject. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time explaining why Turkey is important and relevant. We all know that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on everyone's background, since I'm certain you know these two speakers very well. Henri Barquet, who will speak first, is a professor of international relations at Lehigh University. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and has worked at the Wilson Center and in the State Department during the Obama administration.
Clinton, not Obama.
Clinton, I'm so sorry. Clinton administration.
He's older than he looks.
And Stephen Cook, who we go back a long way to the Carnegie Endowment back in the 90s, but he's made a name for himself at the Council on Foreign Relations, writing some really rather remarkable books on the Middle East, particularly Egypt and Turkey. And they're both going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes. As I understand it, Henri, you're going to go first and talk a little bit about the internal situation in Turkey and where Erdogan stands with respect to the economy and how this affects politics. And then Stephen will broaden out into the incredible bilateral issues between Turkey and Europe, Turkey and the United States, Turkey and Iran, Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Israel. It doesn't stop, and I think this should be a very interesting session. So without any further ado, Henri, you're up.
Is that what we agreed to, Steve? Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for coming. I will start with the obvious, and that is that Turkey has now come and has been transformed into a one-person, one-man populist authoritarian regime. And all decisions now, big and small, are now being taken at the presidential palace. Other institutions of the state, whether it's its parliament, the judiciary, the military, the educational system, everything is now under control of the palace and of Erdogan. I mean, I have sometimes this vision that he probably decides what kind of toilet paper should be bought for all the universities in Turkey, because he's such a micromanager. But I start with this kind of simplistic and obvious statement only because that it actually changes the way we look at Turkey analytically. I just had to finish an article for a book that's being published, or hopefully will be published, but anyway, on Turkish foreign policy, and it took me really a few months to write it, and I apologize when I sent it this week. I said, look, I can't figure it out anymore, in the sense that there is no longer a Turkish foreign policy. There is no longer a way of looking at Turkey in terms of national interest. And the best way to summarize this is by simplifying it to, is it good for Erdogan or is it bad for Erdogan? And that's what it basically boils down to. If you start with that premise and look at what's going on today, and Steve and I decided we're not going to go that long so we can answer more questions. The biggest and most important challenge facing Erdogan now is the economy. And the economic downturn that we are seeing now is very serious, and it's only the beginning. Yesterday, inflation numbers clocked at 25%. If you look at producer price numbers and you look at other factors, you realize that this is going to go up even further in the next months, in the next few months. The Turkish economy, and Erdogan's big thing was growth, 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 and the Turks were always very proud, or Erdogan was always very proud of how fast the Turkish economy was growing compared to the other economies around the world. And that's not only the growth rate is going to slow down this year, but Turkey is going to go into a major recession next year. I think the most optimistic number that I see is a 3% decline in GDP. And I say that's optimistic because the rise in the inflation rate, which will have to push, and we can talk about this a little bit in greater detail later, interest rates is going to create this almost a stagflation kind of situation in Turkey. And the fact that this crisis is coming about just when Erdogan crowned himself as the Uber boss, the Uber leader, is actually pretty bad for him. And in that sense, he really has to figure out how he's going to manage this crisis. The biggest challenge, and that's the one thing he's not really probably aware of, is that because he has surrounded himself with acolytes, with yes men, they're almost all men, the kind of information that he's getting is not always the best information. So the decision-making system is also suffering a great deal in Turkey. So when you're facing this kind of quite serious economic crisis problems, you do need to have a relatively good economic team in place, and he doesn't have it. He has his son-in-law as the person in charge of the economy, and his son-in-law's credentials are, shall we say, rather dubious. The one person that he had that the international financial institutions looked up to and actually appreciated and had a good conversation with, this guy called Mehmet Şimşek, has been essentially removed from, and he's now back in London. So there really is there isn't really an interlocutor on the economic side with whom the international financial institutions, the banks, etc., can talk and can have trust in. The central bank is under enormous amount of pressure from Erdogan because Erdogan doesn't believe in interest rates. He thinks that interest rates are part of the problem, and therefore that if you want to fight inflation, you don't increase interest rates, you actually decrease interest rates. And well, last month, the central bank did increase interest rates, and rather dramatically. We're going to see what's going to happen this month when the bank meets. I have, and this is not on the basis of knowledge, just speculation, that my hunch was that Erdogan probably told the bank last month, okay, you can do whatever you want, do the shock treatment if you want, but you're not going to be able to do it many more times. And at some point, we will see him intervening in the economy. And I say intervening because his tendency is not to intervene, as I said, in just about every decision-making issue. So that's but what's interesting, of course, is that we do see a certain amount of adjustment on the part of Erdogan. Adjustment in the sense that this is a guy who only a year ago was calling the Dutch and the Germans Nazi remnants. Not exactly nice words, obviously. You looked at the Turkish press, which, by the way, is 95% controlled by Erdogan, and it's kind of fun to look at the front pages of all the newspapers because you see the same stuff being said, and those of you who worked on Russia or the Soviet Union know this very well. I mean, it's really Pravda resurrected. So, whereas there was this enormous amount of animosity towards Europe and the United States, that animosity towards Europe is now changing. And it's changing rather dramatically. If you look at today's papers, or there's a new dawn in Dutch-Turkish relations. Same thing is true with Germany. He was in Germany for 3 days, and he actually behaved himself in Germany, Erdogan, surprisingly. He did not. People were afraid that he was going to do some rabble-rousing with Turkish citizens in Germany. He hasn't done that. And the reason he hasn't done all of this is because he realizes that he cannot afford to have more crises with the Europeans at a time when he desperately needs to refinance. I mean, the Turkish private sector, not the central government, the Turkish private sector is in the hook for refinancing about $220 billion in debt in the next 6 months. Surprisingly, the Turkish debt ratio, the debt to GDP ratio, is actually pretty respectable. So the Turks do have a certain amount of cushion to play with. But you are seeing that the impact of the crisis is having an impact. The crisis is having an impact on the way the Turks are now adjusting their foreign policy, and part of the crisis is also Erdogan made, in the sense that the Turkish lira has lost about 40% of its value since the beginning of the year, and a large chunk of that depreciation came about when President Trump got very upset with Erdogan when the deal they had made over the release of the pastor, Andrew Brunson, the pastor who was in jail for 2 years and then was supposed to be released, and instead Erdogan at the last minute changed his mind and decided to relegate him to house arrest. And Trump did not take it well, and you remember he said some not nice things about Turkey, and that really hit the Turkish lira. So when you look at the debt that the Turkish private sector has to refinance, this is a debt that is in foreign exchange, in dollars, and therefore it's far more difficult to refinance when you're making money with Turkish liras at home and you have to produce dollars. So Erdogan is under pressure. So this is, in a way, paradoxically, the moment to, if anybody wants anything from Erdogan, this is the moment to do it. Which will bring me to say that I think on October 12th, when Pastor Brunson goes to court, I will go on a limb and say that they're going to release him on October 12th and pack him and send him home. Because I think they realize that if they don't release him, you have a president of the United States who's a little bit unpredictable, and he can go on another rampage and shave off another, I don't know, 10%, 15% of the Turkish lira, maybe more. So Erdogan now is feeling for the first time the constraints. That said, the other side of the coin, which is domestic policy and the Kurds and Syria, and I'll just a little bit go into Syria and leave it to Stephen to finish, is that Erdogan also is looking for a win somewhere. And increasingly you're seeing him not only just in the negotiations with the Russians on Idlib, but also preparation for another intervention in Syria against the Syrian Kurds. Now, for Erdogan, the Syrian Kurds are the real challenge. They're a real challenge in the following sense. Remember, Bahram Saleh has become the president of Iraq today, but the Kurdish region in Iraq is now a federal recognized part of Iraq. And although the Turks initially had a hard time accepting this, then very intelligently they shifted policy and they accepted the federal arrangement in Iraq and went into business with northern Iraq, and northern Iraq became essentially one of the most important export markets for the Turks. But this is different than having a similar arrangement in Syria, because the way what the Turks are seeing is that what's happening in Syria, especially with American involvement, given there was American involvement in Iraq as well, that Syria may also end up with a federal arrangement. And the Syrian Kurds are very, very closely aligned with the Turkish Kurds and the PKK, and therefore, if the Syrian Kurds were to obtain autonomy the same way the Iraqi, so who's next? That leaves Iran and Turkey. So it is a real serious strategic challenge both for Erdogan and for Turkey, and in many ways this is the most important defining foreign policy issue for Turkey other than the economy, and that's where Erdogan's decision-making abilities worry me a little bit, because as he gets pressured in terms of the economy, whether or not he's going to become even more adventurous on another front. And Stephen can.
Thank you very much indeed. Steve.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much to Jeff for the kind invitation and for the absolutely stupendous lunch. I thought CFR had good lunch, but Center for National Interest has better lunch. And
That's on the record.
It's definitely on the record. It's going to put some pressure on the council. Anyway, and it's great to share the dais with Henri, my friend, teacher, and great colleague. Just to start, in our email exchanges setting this up, Jeff posed a question, and it was an offhand question, but it was basically, where is Turkey? And I just want to start with that, give you some food for thought before I get into some of the details of the geostrategic issues facing Turkey and a number of other countries. There's a tendency among Western analysts, particularly in Washington, to look at Turkey and want to place it in the east, in the west, or it's drifting from the west to the east, or drifting east, and periodically we see articles, who lost Turkey? You know, the Turks really don't look at it this way. They see Turkey as a great power in its own right, and which is consistent with Erdogan's declaration, and you may have heard it if you're paying any attention to the UNGA meetings last week, when he said the world is bigger than five. He means obviously bigger than the UN Security Council. And this is deeply resonant with his constituency. It's not an innovation of the Justice and Development Party. It's a standard part of the Turkish Islamist and nationalist worldview. But the fact that he is out there and he is saying these things and he is altering and has altered Turkish foreign policy is something that I think is to great political benefit. I think this idea that the world is bigger than five, and that Turkey, that the United States in particular has wanted to relegate Turkey to the idea that it's an asset to the United States, not a partner in its own right, is something that is deeply appealing to his core constituency, and quite honestly beyond his core constituency. So now, what does that mean for Turkey and its relations with countries like Germany, where President Erdogan just visited, Iran, Russia, and of course I think the Syria issues that Henri just explicated are derivative of, in many ways, of the Turkey's relations with Iran and Russia, and then of course the United States. And I, not to be too sneaky about it, but it's all very complicated. And let's just take the Germany visit for a moment. I think the fact that Turkey is in a dire economic situation plays to Erdogan's advantage with Mrs. Merkel, and other European leaders. And just a slight disagreement at great hazard with Henri. I'm not sure that although actually I drive him home, so it's okay. There was a moment in the visit in Germany where Erdogan misbehaved, and that was at the dinner with President Steinmeier, where he accused the Germans of harboring terrorists and demanded the extradition of Gülenists in the country. This was after he really took it on the chin from the German press about the treatment of journalists in Turkey. Turkey is the world's leading jailer of journalists, outstripping China and Egypt. And I think he went to Germany trying to keep that bluster under control, but really couldn't help himself. But still, even with that, I think the Europeans are so concerned about Turkish economic implosion that hammered between the consequences of a Turkish economic implosion and Turkish behavior at home, which they find totally unacceptable, I think that they have determined that they will play ball with Erdogan in an effort to prevent the consequences that they fear. And I think the nice words about the Dutch are part of this, because the Dutch came out very strongly in opposition to the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish fighting force that the United States has been involved with in the Syria conflict, which I'll get to. So Erdogan has clearly wanted to have better relations with the EU since the summer when President Trump applied additional tariffs on Turkish aluminum and steel, and there was this war of words that were going on in July and August. But it's really Turkey's fundamental economic weakness that actually, in a paradoxical way, gives Erdogan some power and some hand in dealing with the European leaders. Moving from Germany, talk about Iran. I've heard people often invoke the idea that, Turkey and Iran should be competitors because the Ottomans and the Safavids were competitors, and that sounds very intellectual and deep and so on and so forth. I don't actually think anybody really thinks about it in these terms, and I think that we can tell ourselves those kinds of things and hope that those things that happens, but in practice, the Turks have done much to undermine American foreign policy with regard to Iran. Going back to the TRR deal, the nuclear deal between Turkey, Iran, and Brazil. No on sanctions on Iran. Their vote no on sanctions on Iran in the UN Security Council. Erdogan's essentially blessing the Iran nuclear program during a visit in 2010. He did blow an Israeli spy ring in Istanbul that was monitoring the Iran nuclear program. Halkbank's role in helping the Iranians evade sanctions. This is the largest sanctions busting scheme in history, much bigger than the PNP Paribas case. And what's I think extraordinary about all of these examples of its relationship with Iran, the Turks can still buy copious amounts of gas from the Iranians and not do any of these things. We would have given them a pass. We have given them a pass on buying gas from the Iranians. We understand how important it is to the Turkish economy. We understand how important it is to heating in the eastern part of Turkey during long, cold winters, that they would have gotten a pass. Yet they still continue to do all of this. From Iran, let me turn briefly to Russia. I think the relationship with Russia tends to sometimes be overblown, and then sometimes I think it's entirely accurate to understand that the Turks are moving closer to the Russians. I think this is born of a certain amount of pragmatism on the part of Ankara. After years of trying to encourage, cajole, embarrass the United States to engage in regime change in Syria, oh, by the way, from Jordan, not from Turkish territory, Erdogan gave up and came to understand that despite being a leading member of the Assad-Must-Go camp, his real interests in Syria was snuffing out Kurdish nationalism, preventing the nightmare catastrophe scenario of the emergence of an independent Kurdish state or entity that would be widely perceived to be a terrorist state on Turkey's southern border, that in order to ensure his interests in Syria, he had to go to Moscow. And he had to say sorry for shooting down the Russian plane and withstand a lot of pressure from Vladimir Putin in order to get to a place where he can, to some extent, try to secure his interests in preventing, as I said, the emergence of a Kurdish state in Syria. That has led to a whole host of other issues in which the Russians and the Turks are cooperating. The S-400 purchase, if it ever happens. The deal on Idlib, I think, is a perfect example of Russian-Turkish cooperation. Now, there are dangers for the Turks here. The Russians notoriously are playing both ends of the stick when it comes to the Kurds. When it comes to the deal on Idlib, the Turks really do have to perform. They have 1 month to do something that they were previously totally unable to do, which suggests to me that this deal really delays an assault on Idlib rather than permanently forestalling it. But nevertheless, I think the record would suggest that the Turks, believing that the world is bigger than five, believing that they have different interests and priorities from its traditional allies, have found a working relationship with Moscow that they had not had before, or had not had over a sustained period of time. Now, the really big issue is the United States, and I was somewhat. I kind of chuckled yesterday afternoon when I got an email. This is on the record, huh? Okay. Well, no offense to my friends at the German Marshall Fund, but I got an email from my friends at the German Marshall Fund inviting me to a session called "How to Revive the American and European Relations with Turkey." It strikes me, this is kind of a tick in what we want to save a relationship. We need to rescue the relationship. my question to everybody is why? Turkey's strategic utility to the United States is kind of at this point really theoretical. No doubt during the Cold War, Turkey was very important as a deterrent, second largest military in NATO. And of course, during the Cold War, there were tons of problems. Never broke the relationship, but it did disrupt the relationship. And I think the problems in the U.S.-Turkey relationship now are quite real. They're more than just the particular personalities of President Trump and President Erdogan. I think in many ways it's structural, where the world has turned a lot in the 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And I think that Turkey sees things quite differently from the United States. And I think that the problems, which I will now list without going into great detail about them, are a reflection of these structural problems and the differences in priorities and interests and certainly values. I mentioned it before, the purchase of S-400. Whether we've seen any number of signing ceremonies about the purchase of the S-400. I think they're running out of pens in Ankara. But President Erdogan continues to insist that the S-400 will be a Turkish system, and it will arrive in Turkey and be put to operational use. Clearly, the United States and Turkey are working at cross purposes in Syria. In a broad abstract, neither of us like Bashar al-Assad, but we are working with the YPG. The YPG is linked directly to the PKK. We're working with Turkey's mortal enemies, terrorists. They clearly don't like that, but we were left with very little choice when in 2014 we sought partners on the ground to fight the Islamic State, and the Turks said, first, you have to negotiate access to Incirlik Air Base, and second, we're not as interested in that. We're more interested in snuffing out Kurdish nationalism. And then, of course, I went through some detail on the Iran sanctions issue. Fourth issue is the detention of Americans. Henri mentioned Pastor Andrew Brunson. There is some expectation that he will be freed on October 12th. There's another view that he may not be. After all of this back and forth between the United States over the pastor, he would be seen as knuckling under to President Trump. So I'm willing to believe Henri on this, that we'll see Pastor Brunson touch down at somewhere in the United States on the 13th of October. But there is a view that Erdogan may not politically be able to do that, even given all his accumulation of power. But beyond Andrew Brunson, there's 15 to 20 other Turkish Americans who are being held in jail in Turkey on trumped-up terrorism charges, as well as 3 foreign service nationals. These are employees of the U.S. Embassy who are being held. Henri and Ambassador Eric Edelman wrote a piece about this in the Washington Post. These people are clearly picked up to be bargaining chips over either Fethullah Gülen or Mehmet Hakan Atilla, this banker who is connected, the manager of Halkbank, who was convicted in federal court in New York and is sentenced to 32 months in jail. I think we call them bargaining chips. Amnesty International has actually called them hostages. Then we have just the general vilification of the United States and the debasing of the relationship. Not only has Henri been identified as a coup plotter, but so has General Joseph Votel. The CIA, obviously, any number of others have been identified as involved in the failed coup d'etat with no evidence whatsoever. We now have a generation of young Turks who know nothing other than the vilification of the United States. That's deeply, deeply corrosive. And it's not just a Justice and Development Party problem. If you go and talk to people from the Republican People's Party, they are just as nasty, if not in some cases nastier, than the Justice and Development Party. And then there's a series of lesser-known irritants in the relationship. The Turks establishing a naval presence in the Red Sea, which only heightens tension with Egypt, and heightens tension between Sudan and Egypt, and heightens tension between Ethiopia and Egypt. Totally an unnecessary thing, especially since the Egyptians believe that the Turks are engaged in, have been responsible for destabilization of Egypt. I think the evidence of that is as thin as the evidence that the Turks cite for a variety of other things, but nevertheless, that's the way in which the Egyptians view the world. Then, of course, there's the uptick in air operations in the Aegean that has forced the Greeks to increase their operations. We had a Greek MiG pilot die after interdicting the Turks, you had Turkish drones coming into the Greek airspace where the Greek prime minister was visiting. A variety of things like that are just provocative and unnecessary. Then we have the situation in Jerusalem where the Turkish government agents are involved in whipping up outrage on the Temple Mount. And then, of course, the issue that I think Congress is quite exercised about is the fact that, Erdogan's security team beat up American citizens peacefully protesting against him. And then the Turkish foreign minister showed up in DC jail and sat for photos with two of those gentlemen with big smiles on his face. So it was kind of sticking his finger in the eye. Look, the Turks also have their own list of grievances against the United States. And in ways they mirror our grievances of the Turks. And I can go through those as well. But the point is that in a way that we believe the Turks are enabling extremists, abetting Russian power, destabilizing the region, they think we're doing the same exact thing. And as I said before, the United States and Turkey have different interests, priorities, and values. This litany of things that I've gone through doesn't sound to me like this is a country that's a strategic partner. In some ways, it sounds a little bit more like a country that does not like the American order in and around its region that advances American interests and American power. In that way, in a very abstract way, I don't want to say Turkey is the same as Iran or Russia, but in that way it shares some interest with Iran or Russia. That doesn't mean that the U.S. and Turkey can't cooperate. I think that'll be episodic in the future. I think it'll be on discrete issues. But I don't think we have a strategic relationship. I think Washington needs to recognize that the world has changed and that Turkey's place in it for the United States is very different than the place it was in during the Cold War. Thanks.
Well, thank you both very, very much for an excellent sort of succinct summary of a whole range of issues facing Turkey. I'm going to just add to your list by asking you to both expand a little on the Israel relationship, because for years that was a very important factor. First, as they were allies, and then they were bitter enemies. And now, apart from the Temple Mount, I'd be interested to know how you see the state of the Israeli-Turkish relationship, because that's so obviously linked to the Trump administration and American policy. Want to go first with that, Andy?
I'm not sure exactly how the Trump administration is looking at the Turkish-Israeli relationship, but the Turkish-Israeli relationship is bizarre. Bizarre in the sense that the rhetoric in Turkey against Israel is obviously very harsh. And if you read Turkish papers, there are two countries united. Turkey is at war with, one is Israel, the other one is the United States. But the irony, of course, is that there are, I think, 9 round-trip flights from Tel Aviv to Istanbul every day. The business relationship is actually quite robust. The Turks, as I said, take every single position against Israel, and they undermine Israeli security in very different ways. But yet, there is this relationship, economic relationship, that is quite significant. They're not going to break completely with the Israelis, but we also have to look at the Israeli relationship in terms of a domestic football in Turkey. For the longest time, between especially the military that was trying to challenge Erdogan, and Erdogan was trying to put the military in its place, Israel became something that each side used in different ways. The Turkish military would try to improve relations with the Israelis on a military level, just to annoy Erdogan, and Erdogan would ramp up the rhetoric and the issues. So last week there was some rumors that there was secret negotiations between the two sides and to kind of slightly improve the relationship. But the Turks are very conscious that there is a limit to as to how far they can go with the Israelis in terms of pushing them, because they're afraid of the Jewish lobby worldwide that controls everything. But this is those two countries will never go back to what it was. And Erdogan really doesn't like Israelis. I mean, if he had his druthers, he would get rid of it. But the world is bigger than Erdogan.
Just very quickly from the Israeli perspective, when the last time I was there, the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs very much wants to revive the relationship with Turkey, much the way I think people here would like to do it. But Prime Minister Netanyahu and Minister of Defense Lieberman say, what for? Who needs it? Erdogan's nothing but a problem. During this period where the two countries have been at odds, at least rhetorically, and their relations have been downgraded diplomatically, Israel, from their perspective, has achieved much in the region. Very close ties with Greece and Cyprus, improvement of its relations with Egypt, the big enchilada, a robust security cooperation with the UAE and the Saudis and the Jordanians. Kind of from where the Israelis sit right now, the Turks are more trouble than they're actually worth, given the development of its relations with its countries around it. And just to give you a sense of how kind of neuralgic the Turks are for the Israelis, Israeli officials said to me, we actually trust the Qataris in Gaza more than we trust the Turks. Which I think is telling, because it speaks to where the relationship once was and where it really is now. But of course, as Henri pointed out, there's tons of flights, there's lots of business, but all of those things are really under the radar. Really under the radar. And the entire narrative, the entire pro-AKP press, which, as Henri said, is 95% of the press, are mobilized to say very nasty things about Israel and Jews worldwide.
Okay. The one thing, and Stephen reminded me of this, the one thing we do need to watch out for is gas in the Eastern Mediterranean. And that is to say that the Turks are trying to claim sovereignty over even Greek Cypriot territorial waters by virtue of their relationship with Northern Cyprus. And if the Israelis, the Egyptians, and the Cypriots and the Greeks get together to build pipelines, all kinds of other types of ways of transporting gas from those big fields that have been discovered in those waters, we may see trouble with the Turkish Navy, as the Turkish Navy is doing essentially all kinds of maneuvers around that area. That's the one big worrisome issue on that front.
All right then, so let's open this up to discussion and comment, and I will make a list of names of who would like to go first. Yeah. Jacob, since you are very prominent back there.
I guess the one thing I wonder about is how do you, the panelists, think that Russia can exploit this situation?
I think the Russians have exploited the difficulties in the U.S.-Turkey relations in the way that it's exploited difficult relations the United States has with any number of countries in the region. And I think that the Russians view this as in a broader strategic context, which is to kind of weaken the transatlantic alliance. They don't have to necessarily flip the Turks in the way that, for example, the United States flipped the Egyptians in the 1970s. But they need to pull the Turks just enough away from the United States. Now, we're doing a good enough job of that on our own, but to give enough to the Turks in Syria and other places that, keeps them coming back. And I think that that's a successful thing from the perspective of the Russians.
Let me just add one thing to that. So Erdogan visited Putin and they had this deal over Idlib. Do you think the S-400s were discussed in that meeting? I bet they were. And I bet Putin got an assurance from Erdogan that he's going to buy the S-400s, whatever the American pressure is. And that in it for itself is going to create a huge amount of trouble here on the Hill, much less one maybe with the administration, but certainly on the Hill. And that's one way in which Russia has probably been very successful in creating problems.
There was a question. Yes. Well, you two, and then the lady, then Jerry Bremer.
So,
please state your name and affiliation. Thank
Andrew
you.
Steinfeld, retired Foreign Service. Two quick questions. One on Gulen. I'm just curious if I've lost the thread. Is there any legal thing going on now in terms of extradition in the U.S. courts to get him back to Turkey? And second, if you could expand a little bit on relations with the Gulf. I know fairly well that the Emiratis and the Turks have dreadful relations. I'm not sure the relationship with Saudi is quite as bad. But, and if you could comment on the Khashoggi caper, which is a wonderful example of, I mean, how that is solved may say a lot about the relations between Saudi and Turkey.
And if you explain the Khashoggi case, perhaps you could explain to the audience exactly what it is, because I'm not sure.
I'll leave Khashoggi to Steve. He's a buddy of his. No, let me deal with Gulen. So, Gulen, who's in Pennsylvania, look, from what I understand is what the FBI is doing, among all these other investigations it's doing, of course.
No, that one's over, so they can focus on Gulen.
Is to look at the Gulen network of schools, the schools that he created here and elsewhere in the world, but the ones, of course, here for the FBI, to see if there's anything they can find to curtail the operations, do something against him. But the evidence that the Turks have provided so far to get Gulen extradited on the coup is the figment of their imagination. I mean, they just make things up, right? And they think for them, you know, it's like we used to do it with the communists. You know, there's a communist under every bed, and there's a Gulenist under every bed in every institution. I mean, they are still every week arresting more and more soldiers because they're Gulenists. There's no way on earth there are so many Gulenists, certainly in the military. It doesn't matter, right? But so the evidence they have is completely fictitious. There's nothing the U.S. government can do on that evidence. But in a concession to the Turks, they are looking at the schools. And by the way, those schools were not very kosher by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, they did things like they brought in, and that's also our immigration system. I mean, they brought English teachers from Eastern Turkey, for crying out loud, to the United States to teach Americans English. Give me a break, right? I mean, there was all kinds of shenanigans that were going on with those schools, but that's why maybe there is some, but that's not enough to extradite them.
On the Gulf and the Jamal Khashoggi thing, first on the Gulf, you're absolutely right. You know, the Emiratis and the Turks, this is very, very bad. Very, very bad. And, you know, from the perspective of the Emiratis, the Turks have been enabling the Muslim Brotherhood and extremists around the region. And that's, you know, that is their position, and they strongly communicated that to everyone around the region and everyone in the United States, that's where they view. And, you know, I think the Turks taking in the Muslim Brotherhood after the coup d'etat in Egypt and allowing them to try to destabilize Egypt from Istanbul through television and other media fed a narrative that has deepened mistrust and suspicion between the Emiratis and the Egyptians. On Saudi Arabia, it's a little more ambiguous. I think that King Salman is ambivalent about Turks, but he recognizes that Turkey is a big, important country, so he's willing to kind of hold his nose, despite the fact that they've worked at cross purposes on the Qatar situation, on the Egypt situation. What strikes me about the Jamal Khashoggi thing, Jamal Khashoggi is a Saudi journalist who left Saudi Arabia, is quite critical of the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He is at least sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. He writes a semi-regular column for the Washington Post, and he was at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, and he never emerged. The Saudis say they don't have him, and the Turks say he never left. Who knows what's happened? Although, you know, extraordinary rendition is not something that's unheard of. Yeah. What I think we should be mindful of is that it strikes me that the Saudis could not get Jamal Khashoggi out of Istanbul without at least the knowledge of the Turks. And the fact that the Turkish foreign ministry is summoning the Saudi ambassador to lecture them on the stat and find out the status of Jamal Khashoggi is quite frankly kind of hilarious, because again, Turkey is the world's leading jailer of journalists in the world. Since when have they been so concerned about the fate of journalists? So I'm not sure it's going to have a dramatic impact when it's resolved on Saudi-Turkish relations. I think there's something deeper going on here between the Saudis and the Turks. And Jamal Khashoggi, I think in all likelihood, is probably not in Turkey any longer.
Okay,
Marcel.
Thank you very much. Marcel Wahba, the Arab Gulf States Institute. I'd be very curious to hear a little more about the domestic situation in Turkey. You talked about the dire economy and certainly this ongoing search on Gulenists and jailing journalists and otherwise. While not a significant majority, there are a number of Turks who are not comfortable with all this. Is Erdogan in total control? And does he have any competition? Is there any likelihood of any instability given the economic situation? Or is it wishful thinking?
You're giving me a chance to make a pitch to the national interest, because I'm planning to write a long article calling it the coming Turkish spring. And it's not coming anytime soon, so let's not exaggerate. Erdogan doesn't have any challenges at home. The main opposition party, the Republican People's Party, that's been Atatürk's party, they would not be able to get out of it paper bag if their life depended on it. I mean, they are completely useless. His control over the state apparatus is so complete now. I'm not joking. I mean, he probably decides what kind of toilet paper gets bought in different universities. That's the kind of control, because he's detail-oriented. I mean, I genuinely think the guy has a supercomputer up in here, because you can't keep up with all these things. But that's also his Achilles heel. He does, I think close to 50% of the population is with him. But the opposition is getting essentially more and more, it's getting angrier. I mean, you have essentially almost 20% of Kurds. Some Kurds are with him, but not many anymore. And as I said, if you read the Turkish press, you will never get a whiff of opposition in Turkey. So you have to read and you have to watch websites, and that's why they jail journalists. That's why, and people are being jailed. For really obscenely ridiculous excuses. Anybody Erdogan doesn't like, they just invent something and they put him in jail, and put him or her in jail, and for long periods of time, and you don't see a judge for a long time, for a long period of time. I mean, one of the most important civil society leaders in Turkey, and this guy who's Osman Kavala, who's really spent a lot of time building art institutions, etc. But he was a critic. So they jailed him for two reasons. They invented that he was involved in the protests in 2013. And then they found a video of him talking to me for 3 minutes. And therefore they said, since I organized a coup and I talked to him, and then they decided that within the space of, just to show you how ridiculous, in the space of the 3 days or 4 days I was in Turkey, that he and I talked for 93 hours, 34 minutes, and 1 second. This is every Turkish newspaper has repeated this idiotic mantra. It doesn't matter. People believe that, right? But that's what the Achilles heel is. There is going to be an explosion. The economy is going to help that. But at some point, he will not be able to deliver and he's going to make mistakes, because the decision-making system is weak, because he only has yes people around him. All the grandees of the AKP that came together in 2002, 2003 came to power together, the Abdullah Güls and all this, they've all been pushed out. So there is no adult supervision. Right? If Erdogan says the world is flat tomorrow, they're all going to say the world is flat tomorrow.
Just one quick thing, because Henri wandered into this. And I think the question that people have is how stable is Erdogan? How stable is Turkey? I think when you think about his rule, I think about it in terms of coercion, bribery, and vision. His vision has been prosperity, piety, and Turkish power. But he's had to use a lot more coercion than ever before to get the things that he wants. He relies on bribery, but as the economy runs into trouble, he'll have less patronage to grease the wheels. And that vision thing, piety, prosperity, and Turkish power, I think enough people, as Henri pointed out, still believe in that. They've experienced that. But the prosperity thing is open to question. How he responds to things like the pressure on Andrew Brunson, how he deals with the question of Idlib, because there really is a clock ticking there, will tell people about whether the world is bigger than 5, that's a real thing, or that's just something that he says. He does have a constituency that believes anything he says, but if these 3 things come together in a way, he might find himself in trouble.
Okay, I have 3 on the list right now.
Tracy Wilkinson.
Oh, okay, well, I'll get the
Good 4 on the list.
4 on the list. So that's Jerry Bremer, Richard Burt, Oda Aberdeen, and Ms. Wilkinson. So in that order. So Jerry, you're up.
Thank you, Jerry Bremer, retired dictator. We tend in this town to focus almost entirely on the political situation, but I think the economic situation in Turkey is probably going to determine what's going to happen next. You have this high inflation. The lira is down at least 20% already, probably headed for more like 40%.
No, it is
It's 40% down.
Down
since the
40%.
beginning of the
Down
year.
40.
Yeah.
The
In
beginning.
other words, take a look at Buenos Aires. It's exactly what happened in Argentina. And they've just been required to do a new IMF loan. Who owns Turkish debt? Do they have any kind of a position with the IMF at this point? Would Erdogan actually listen to Christine Lagarde if she showed up and said, let's see if we can help you? Or is he really on the slide? I think this is more likely, other than the accidents that could happen, this is more likely to determine how Turkey looks in the next 2 years than any of the political stuff.
Well, I mean, that's.
I'm sorry, could I add to that? Just briefly, just in this context.
Yes.
Could you
say who you are?
could you please also,
say who you are, please?
It's Russian Embassy, Artur Lukmanov. Could you add to this, what is the Turkish contribution to the current efforts in Iraq with regards to the president, the speaker, and the prime minister of the country? What is the Turkish role and the interest?
I see, that's a rather different
Well, yeah, it's
question,
a
but
different
it's still a good one. It's still a good one. So,
Henri, did you want to get in
you
on
want
the
to do
second
the
option?
economy
Yeah.
and
I have
then
a couple
go
thoughts
to
on
Iraq?
Okay. On the economy, as I said at the beginning, I mean, this is the Achilles heel of Erdogan. The lira is down, the inflation rate is going to go further up. I mean, it's now 25%. It's going to go up significantly. And people did not expect the 25% number that came out yesterday. They thought it was going to be much less than that. No, there is no IMF plan. He does not want an IMF plan. Most of the Turkish debt. So here's what he has done is that he has increasingly taken companies, semi-private ones and even some private ones, into. They have this huge fund. I forget what they call it now. It'll come to me. A state fund, right? So this is a way it's bailing them out, right? The Turkish debt, national debt, as a percentage of GDP is only 25%, which means there's a lot of room for the Turkish, for them to socialize the debt.
But who owns the debt?
Spanish and French banks.
Right.
Correct.
So the private
Surprisingly large.
the private
Spanish,
companies
the
are
largest debt.
the private companies are really indebted, and they're indebted to European banks, Spaniards especially, but all over, and also by the United States as well, right? So the debt is spread, and as I said, there's about $220 billion that's due for renegotiation in the next 6 months. So that's the next 6 months in that sense are critical. But that doesn't mean that he will necessarily, because of the economic crisis now, lose power. Right? He has many tools, as an ex-dictator would know, at his disposal. He can manage the situation, and so I think the Turkish Spring that I think will come in a very different way when we don't expect it and down the road.
Very quickly on the economic thing, and I'll weigh in best I can on the Iraq issue. First, speaking of Iraq, Ambassador Bremen, when you identified yourself, I thought you were going to say you were Okemo Mountain's most well-known ski instructor, but you know. On this question of Erdogan has turned this from his own economic mismanagement into defying the United States, the IMF, and others. It's a nationalist virtue. And it's, again, one of these issues that is going to test him because the economy will continue to slide.
Right.
What does he do? My sense is that so far, you know, when things got really bad in July and August, he hammered away on trust in God and blaming the United States. And of course, President Trump's tweets announcing additional tariffs gave him a whole narrative about American economic warfare. So I think, and he's hung tough, and it's actually worked fairly well. I expect that he will continue to hang tough as long as he can, appeal to God, and blame the United States for economic warfare. But at some point,
Right.
Spanish banks, French banks, and that's why Merkel and the Dutch and all these people are suddenly holding their tongue about the kind of latter-day reign of terror that has been visited upon Turkey by Erdogan over the course of the last 2.5 years, because they fear not just the consequences of Turkish collapse, but the consequences of the collapse of European banks. What that moment is, I mean, I think that the betting in the kind of Turkey watching community is Erdogan has 6 months and then he's going to go to the IMF and there's really nothing they can do. I don't see any real evidence of that. I think that they hang on. Even if his son-in-law goes out and says, you know, fiscal discipline and we're going to rein things in and so on, no investor believes them at all. They have zero credibility. So we're really going to, next 6-8 months is going to be very, very important for Turkey.
Right.
On Iraq, I honestly, I think Ambassador Bremer probably has a better perspective on this, but I think this was an American and Iranian show.
Okay, so Ambassador Burr.
Yeah, I'm a little bit surprised. You, Stephen, you say that the reason that the Europeans have tended to give Erdogan a pass in recent years is because they're concerned recent weeks about the banks. You know, I think the fundamental reason that the Europeans have given the Turks a pass is the Turkish role in stemming migration from the Middle East and Syria. I mean, you know, they paid billions of dollars to the Turks to settle those people and to keep them out of Europe. So my question would be to both of you: to what extent can Erdogan kind of play around or leverage this vulnerability that the Europeans have to another major wave of immigration from the Middle East, which has pretty much ended Angela Merkel's political career. I mean, she's now sort of fading away rapidly, and there are a lot of other leaders in Europe that have seen that happen and want to avoid that fate.
So it's a great point, and an oversight on my part for not talking about it a bit. But I think that what we're seeing, and obviously the refugee issue has destabilized European politics. A big part of it are the Syrians, but you also have the Africans coming up from North Africa. That has really been the dynamic more recently, is the African migrants coming across the Mediterranean. My understanding has been, and maybe my information is old, is that the pipeline out of Syria through Turkey to Europe has diminished quite a bit because of difficulties in Greece, and then up through that eastern corridor where the Hungarians are blocking people, and so there's less.
It's moved west.
It's right, and so I think it's it's diminished somewhat. But of course, the Turks have been willing to threaten this from time to time. My sense is right now, since July and August, the big European concern about Turkey has been the state of the economy and what that means for them. But you're right. You're absolutely right. The refugee issue continues to be very important.
The refugee issue is one that's actually quite complex in the sense that, as Steve said, it's become much more difficult to go across Europe now. The Greeks have made it very difficult to cross the Aegean, and they made the conditions actually quite unpleasant so a lot of refugees don't want to do that. But this is a gun with one bullet. Erdogan can fire this bullet once, but if he does, his relationship with Europe will be finished forever, right? Because given exactly what happened to Merkel last time, the Europeans have made it very clear they don't want it. And if he were to, he can threaten, but if he were to really actually act on it, I think the relationship between Turkey and Europe will completely collapse in a way in which I think it's very difficult to fathom how it will be, because big Europeans were going to see this is a guy who's threatening us, who's trying to destroy us, and you're going to pay a price. And they have tools in their hands.
Oh, yeah.
So, Odor Aberdeen.
Two comments. As far as the Turkish private debt, it has to be financed in the next 6 months, 9 months. But I think the European banks are vulnerable, especially the Italian banks. If you looked at the markets in the past 2 days, the euro has weakened because they're worried about that. Now, Italian banks can't afford a default by the Turks. And the same thing with Deutsche Bank and, as Steve said, the Spanish bank. So that's something we should keep in mind. I think the Turks have leverage over these banks. My question is, what's the loyalty of the Turkish army to Erdogan?
Did you all get that? What's the loyalty of the army to Erdogan?
The Turkish army has been completely neutered. Thank you. Got it. Right. Look, within 4 days of the coup, 50% of all Turkish generals and admirals were cashiered. Now, 50%, an army, an enormous army, right? And there were only 9,000 soldiers on the streets at night of the coup, right? If 50% of the generals were involved, there would have been more than 9,000. That coup would have been a very different coup. And since then, it's not just the generals and the admirals, but colonels, all ranks have been cleansed. And there's a way in which, to me, the analogy is Venezuela. What the Venezuelans did to their own army. The Venezuelan army was not like a Turkish army, autonomous, independent, but the Venezuelan army has now become one of the pillars of the state in Venezuela. It's not that in Turkey yet, but that's what Erdogan's goal is, to essentially make the officer corps loyal to him. And there was one incident during the election campaign this past summer where he gave a speech that was at the table, and a 3-star general was at the table, one of the commanders in the southeast, and he went after the opposition leader, called him all kinds of names, and this general started to applaud and laugh and stuff like that. And then the opposition leader said, "The first thing I will do when I become president," of course he did not become president, is I'm going to cashier this guy out. Of course, this guy got his 4th star just now, right? It's a little anecdote, but this is where the Turkish military is going. It's being made into a loyal institution of Erdogan, not the state of Erdogan.
Let me put just a little point on it, because when I was writing about the Turkish military for my dissertation, I went to Henri, so I don't want to go too far to ask him questions about it. So I don't too far on this, but this really speaks to how different this institution is the Turkish military, for better or worse, always was above politics. Its loyalty was to the principles of Mustafa Kemal. There were bad things about that, no doubt. But with the way in which Erdogan has sought to establish control over the military, not just since the coup, but at least since 2008, and in specifically 2011, when the entire general staff resigned en masse, has been to establish loyalty to him. That creates a factionalized military. So under those circumstances, I think we should be careful about saying that the era of coups d'etat are over, because you have reasonable people can believe that there are now pro-Erdogan factions within the military. There are pro-other factions. There are pro-Kemalist factions. All kinds of factions. This is going to have a significant impact on the standing, professionalism, professional capabilities of the Turkish armed forces.
Tracy Wilkinson.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Tracy Wilkinson from the Los Angeles Times. I hate to ask this question because, frankly, I think the fate of an American evangelical preacher compared to the tens of thousands, it pales compared to the tens of thousands of Turkish journalists, politicians, dissidents, intellectuals who've been arrested. However, this administration, the Trump administration, for reasons we can all guess, has made the fate of a white U.S. Christian the center of its policy. And so, Henri, you said you thought that Erdogan might be willing to release Brunson next week to avoid another Trump rampage, as you put it. And I wondered, wouldn't Erdogan also have to receive something else in return, especially as Steve said, this will have political risks, consequences for Erdogan. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Thank you.
Can I just start with this?
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely right, given the way that politics have lined up. And there's reason to believe that, a court will rule, release him, and Erdogan can say, you see, this is what we've been saying all along, our courts are independent, and we send him up. But obviously there is going to be some sort of fix, because they thought they had a deal in July. You had the woman being held by Israel sent back, and then at the last minute, when they were going to make the deal, the Turks changed the terms of the deal. And what is it that the Turks want? They not only want Mehmet Hakan Atilla back, they want the whole Halkbank thing to go away. They want the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York to burn all of those files. There's something in that they have been investigating that Erdogan really doesn't want to go away. Now, the rumit among journalists in Turkey, of course, those journalists who are outside of Turkey, the rumit is that there's evidence of Erdogan's direct involvement with Iran, or possibly even the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Who knows whether that's the case? But it's been interesting how the Turks have zeroed in on that case and those files to make them go away. I know we're in a different era, but I still would like to believe that the White House can't call up the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, you got to make this thing go away, as much as that's the inclination of President Trump to do. So that, to me, would suggest that Henri's spidey sense is superior, but what is it that we're willing to give them back? It's not going to be Gulen. It can't make Halkbank completely go away. So what exactly is the deal? I don't know. I claim ignorance.
Well, I don't think there's going to be a deal, additional stuff. There was a deal to begin with, and we're not privy to those details, but there was a deal, and Erdogan thought he could play with the administration by changing his mind at the last minute. It is, I think, what the Turks want in the New York case, the Halkbank case. This is the case about as Steve explained, where the Turks broke sanctions and sold and bought gold and with Iran to funnel money to Iran. The Halkbank, which is a state bank, is going to be fined, right? And I think what they're negotiating about is the price. How big is that fine going to be? if we look at, you would know this, the BNP, Banque Nationale de Paris, which got caught, got fined $9.8 billion. The transactions for which the Turks are being sanctioned are much, much larger than what BNP did, by huge amounts, right? So reasonable people would say that then the fine has to be significantly more. At a time when the Turkish economy is in the doldrums, a huge fine would actually be quite devastating for the Turks. So what they're trying to do is actually reduce that fine. That's the best I think they can get, because the banker was judged and tried, and it's the Southern District of New York. But the people who are going to assign the fine are down here somewhere in the city and not in New York. So that's where you can have negotiations. To me, the issue is whether or not the Trump administration also asks for the Foreign Service nationals to be released, right? One of the Foreign Service nationals, by the way, is somebody I've known for 20 years. He's not in jail for Gulen stuff. He works for the consulate in Adana, and he's been working for us for 37 years. He's the eyes and ears of the whole system, foreign system in the United States. He knows every single person in the Kurdish areas in the east and the southeast. Years ago, he told me how he was being harassed by the Turkish police. They would call him at night, they would threaten him, his family, and stuff like that. What they wanted to do is shut him down and shut our operations. Not that he's a spy, he just knows everybody. Every consul general who comes to Adana from somewhere, from Mogadishu or someplace like that in the United States, in the world, by the time they learn the ropes in Adana, this is a guy who teaches them everything. And that's what they want to do. Now, has Trump asked for these guys to be released? I hope he has, but I don't trust that he has.
Well, thank you both very much. I have no one else recognized. This has been the most, John, yes.
No, if I could just press you a little bit more on the question of Iraq.
Ambassador Negroponte.
Yeah, John Negroponte. With this new government, which is sort of taking formation now, I was just wondering if either of you would want to comment a bit about the prospects for Turkish-Iraq relations. Used to be important.
I still think it's very important. I think Steve is right. The Turks were not involved in this. Now remember that Barham Saleh is not KDP. The Turks have a lot of influence with the KDP, with Barzani, but not with the PUK, and certainly not with Barham. I mean, I've known Barham for too long. So I don't think of course there was a deal that brought him to power. But I don't think the Turks were part of it. I think they were probably very surprised, like everybody else, by Barham's selection. Mahdi is also not somebody I think has been close to the Turks in the past. So I don't think the Turks. But you have to deal with Turkey. It's the most important economic power in the region. So both leaders are smart enough to know that they have to be with Turkey.
At the very least, what should reassure the Turks is that Barham has always said that, eventually there'll be Kurdish independence, but he's quite the realist and has said, Iraq's a wealthy country and we can benefit by being within Iraq as long as Kurdish rights are protected. That is, I think, something that, the Turks like to hear. Strangely, it's their allies who are deeply interested in breaking up the country.
But on this issue of Turkish-Iraqi relations, the water issue is very important. And do you see any willingness on the part of Turkey to release more water into Iraq? Because it's a crisis as far as I understand it.
I have not seen anything or any flexibility from the Turkish side. Nothing.
I think that ship has sailed.
Boy. Yes, on this?
Yes, if you read the Iraqi press, I'm talking about the Iraqi Arab press, you can see the Iraqis are angry. The average person in the street is angry about the drought. So it's a key issue.
Right, I agree.
And regarding Adil Abdul Hadi, for the past 2 years, he has been focusing on the economy and oil. So, to me, economic issues are paramount in Iraq, and they wanted to bring someone who can improve the economic situation.
Dave, you heard the last word here.
So kind of a two-part question, kind of going back to S400 for a second.
Just to explain who you are.
David Drimmer, I'm the defense editor for the National Interest. So kind of a two-part question. How serious do you think the Turks are about actually acquiring the S400 and other systems from the Russians? I mean, in the past they've kind of played the Chinese as well. For a while they'd ordered the HQ-9 and it wasn't really that serious. They were basically seeming to try to get more concessions out of Western industry for technology transfer and that sort of thing. Are they actually serious about this? And then, assuming they are, and they do end up purchasing this, and we have the kinds of sanctions, what does that do to the relationship there? Because that could, either if we don't give them a waiver, cause some major problems, so just on your thoughts on both those issues.
Sure. I think there's two things that I would suggest that they may actually go through with this purchase. One is their insistence that they have requested air defense system from the United States, and the United States has been foot dragging and clearly doesn't want to give a system to the Turks, and add on top of that the fact that the president of Turkey is convinced that the United States is interested in regime change in Turkey. So I think that it's important if they actually go through with the purchase. I think the F-35 program is in jeopardy. Within the NDAA, there is language that says directs the Pentagon to study significant changes in the Turkish participation. But the press release that went out with it from Senator Shaheen and Senator Tillis specifically said elimination of Turkey from that program. I think, what does it do to the relationship? I think it suggests everything that I pointed out in the part that I talked about the United States, that we are in this period where the relationship is fundamentally changing, and the idea of a strategic partnership is something really of the past.
Anything to add to that,
Yeah.
Henri?
So, the Turks did want a defense system from us, but what they wanted, which the Americans were not really willing to give, is co-production. That's what failed in terms of the negotiations. But the Russians are not doing co-production either. So it's not as if the Russians are giving them a better deal. Maybe it's a cheaper deal. You know better whether or not the Patriots are better than the S-400s, but I'll leave that to you. But the problem with what the Senate, what the Hill has said is not to sell the F-35s to Turkey in the event the Russians buy the S-400s, because the F-35s will be compromised. But remember that part of the F-35s are built in Turkey. The fuselage, for instance, there are two places where it's being built, Turkey and somewhere in Texas. Right? And Secretary Mattis has said that in the event that the Turks are kicked out, that the production, there's going to be a problem with procurement down the road if the Hill sanctions go through. What's interesting to me, and nobody has answered that question yet, is, well, maybe we won't sell the F-35s to Turkey, but will they still continue to do co-production, because they're going to be making money from that? So it's a little, Mattis may be a little bit playing here, but it is a very serious problem, because I think the Hill is very serious about this.
If that all does happen, you might still get a fundamental break with the rest of the NATO alliance, right? At what point does Turkey just say this is this is no longer worth it for us?
What's not worth it?
NATO? NATO and just relations with the U.S.
Look, the Turks will never leave NATO. They won't. They are in a very dangerous neighborhood. Russia is a neighbor. You can play footsie with the Russians as long as you have NATO behind you. Once NATO is not behind you, so there's no way on earth the Turks are going to leave NATO. So I think that's not even an issue. They can talk about it and stuff like this.
However, if they buy the F-35 over the objections of its NATO partners, they are isolated.
The S-400s.
The S-400. If they buy the S-400 over the objections of its NATO allies, they will be isolated and they will not be able to attend certain things and so on and so forth. So it's it's a significant change. My sense is that they're very serious about going forward, just as Congress is very serious about docking them the F-35.
I think they'll buy now, especially after the Idlib deal, I think they're going to buy the S-400s.
Well, I think we've all had a really excellent sort of duet perform for us today.
We practiced for 5 days on this.
And, lots of questions, lots of issues, all very well answered and very clear and succinct, and a hell of a mess.
Yes.
So thank you
Thank you
very
very
much.
much. Thank you.